Again, everybody, good evening or good afternoon. Thank you for the assistance, whoever that was. Much appreciated. My name is Kali Akuno. I'm in Jackson, Mississippi, he, him pronouns, with the Institute for Social Ecology, which is bringing this series on race and ecology that we've been doing now for close to 9 months. But we're making this a regular monthly feature of some of the work of ISE, with the purpose being, to bring the sharpest ideas that are out there and the sharpest examples of practice that are out there for us to all learn from and try to incorporate as best possible into our practice, wherever we may be and on whatever scale that we may be working in at the moment. And to that end, I brought in someone tonight who I appreciate on all fronts, both, just as what I would call an organic intellectual and organizer, Mel Figueroa. I'm sure all of you have read the biography, so I won't go into that too much and to kind of save some time, but this is someone who I really consider one of the real deals on the front line, who's really advancing, and I don't say that lightly, who I think is advancing kind of the synergy of a lot of ideas, the best from a number of different traditions and bringing them together into kind of a coherent practice that all of us can learn from and build upon and hopefully incorporate in a number of different ways wherever we're at. And just so everyone knows, this is a two-part series. We're doing another one with Mel in June, and just kind of conceptually, it'll be much more organic as things go along this evening. But today was kind of more focused on like intellectual history and theory, and then the next one will be much more focused in on practice and application, right? So I would encourage everyone to participate in both. I think you will get a lot out of it. So I just want to remind everyone of that and encourage everyone to tune in, not just to this one, but the one that's coming up in June. And with that, I think I want to turn it over to you, Mel, for us to get rolling, get started. We're going to start, just so folks know our format in general. We're going to start with a brief presentation from Mel. And then me and Mel have a dialogue and exchange, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Out of respect to everyone's time, we do try to keep these exactly to about 1 hour and 30 minutes, but sometimes, depending on how good we're going, and how deep we get into it, it may run a little bit over. So feel free to, take care, tend to your own needs if you need to leave. Exactly, leave early or leave at that time. Don't feel too pressed. We are recording this and it will be shared everyone publicly after this, is over. So definitely take care of your needs on this Friday night, be there with family, etc. In terms of questions, given how large the group are, what I'm going to ask everyone is to, if you have a question, if you have a point, definitely use our chat feature. And the folks who are not familiar with Zoom, I think all of us have been in Zoom hell now for the past 2 years. But if anybody has not been burdened with Zoom, you can typically find it below. If you look below, scroll down in one of the features, and it has the chat feature. You can type it in there, and then we'll take the questions from that particular point, just to make sure that we kind of keep things coherent. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to you, Mel.
All right, thank you so much, Kali, for that introduction. I'm honored and to know that you think of me so highly. So thank you, and I think of you so highly as well. And I'm so looking forward to this conversation because I feel like it's something that we've been kind of trying to think through for the last several years. Both in collaboration with other movements and, with each other. And, so let me give just a very quick introduction of myself, even though I know you might have read the bios already. But I'll give you a sense of kind of where I'm coming from with this. So right now I'm talking to you from occupied Mechoopda territory, which is in Chico, California. And this is significant because we're right down the hill from Paradise, which was the town in California that was destroyed and burnt to the ground by the Camp Fire in 2018. So I've been living in a disaster area for quite a while on the front lines. And, you know, I think that's really anchored my perspective on, you know, just what we need to be doing in this time period. You know, you know, having been also like a scholar and doing study groups and being in radical theory for a long time, for many years, I kind of had to put that aside because there was a lot of practical work to do, you know, helping disaster and fire survivors, and also dealing with the effects after the Camp Fire of a lot of gentrification, a lot of, you know, homelessness. We have the highest per capita homeless rate in California, and that's saying a lot. And you know, we have a lot of climate refugees. We have a lot of, you know, very acute, you know, a lot of the problems that we hear about in the news are things that I have to deal with every day. So, and I'm working with the Mechoopda tribe right now on land restoration, workforce development, and traditional ecological knowledge for, you know, basically to survive, right? A lot of this, these coming disasters, both ecological and social. So that's kind of where my thinking is coming from. And, you know, a few months ago, you know, we've gotten to a point in our work where I was like, okay, now is the time when I need to kind of look back and think about, how do I think about our work going forward? How can I think about the work that Kali and everybody, you know, and the Solidarity Economy Network and all of these spaces that we're in, these questions that we're all mulling over, what would be the appropriate framework to kind of look at our situations and be able to deal with them, or just a framework, right? I mean, again, all of us are running around, especially after the past 2 years, trying to survive. And you know, if we're going to be organizing with each other and, you know, organizing across a disparate number of geographical contexts as well as social contexts, you know, what is a framework that we can think through when we're thinking about how we deal with the upcoming crisis. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I'm gonna and we'll go to the and so I'm it's about to say, and so I've developed a study group that actually a number of folks from that are participating in now. We're kind of in the middle of it. And so, you know, these are some of the ideas, some of the kind of like theoretical pillars that I've brought together to kind of make sense of my own work, make sense of how I see the world going, and to make sense of how movements can think through and open up different types of possibilities for how we can move forward as, you know, people who are interested in, you know, justice and collective survival going forward. So so here's the context, right? So I went through a little bit of it when I said like all of the things, right? But let me break it down to what I think are sort of the converging crises that are producing a lot of anxiety and also a lot of hope and a lot of questions in this moment. So first is, you know, again, the immediate, an immediate threat, which is climate change. That's an existential threat threatening all life on Earth. And I'm sure as everyone in this room is aware of and concerned about, capitalist accumulation and business as usual, as they call it, is actually accelerating this crisis, right? So how can we, you know, how can we deal with the fact that, you know, disasters are happening? We were just talking a few minutes before this about how, you know, people are bracing for hurricane season. We have the thunderstorms coming through, tornado season. You know, every year things start to get worse. At the same time, capitalism itself is in crisis, right? We have seen now, there's a lot of financial volatility. A lot of people are predicting, this another big crash, or a depression coming this summer. We have the global supply chain issue, the baby formula issue. So, capitalism itself, when it has drawn everybody into this orbit of a global system, a globalized economy, that economy itself is starting to break down so much that, especially here in the global north, a lot of the working class has come to depend on, things that you get from the store. And when those things don't show up, that's going to create a crisis of life for us working people, because at the same time, we all know that there is also those pressures of the capitalist class in trying to hoard and extract as much value and labor from us as they can without paying, without actually compensating adequately for what we need to live. And in all of this, right, we have a political crisis. Kali has talked a lot about fascism. I talked a lot about fascism. And, one of the things to understand about sort of this moment politically is that, reactionary movements in fascism often emerges during a capitalist crisis. When capitalism is in crisis, it's not that it's just going to roll over and die, right? It's going to defend itself, and it's going to defend its own social relations very violently. Right. And so right-wing and fascist political currents exploit these things. They exploit a lot of culture wars that are rooted in, this colonial project of civilization, right? Gender dynamics, racial dynamics, etc., to violently enforce and deepen the unequal organization of society. As one of our colleagues, David Cobb, has always said, fascism is not like oh, my dad's such a fascist, or like this, it's not like a feeling, right? It is a coherent theory about how to organize society. It's monstrous, but it is it's a political current that has a vision and has a strategy. And that's something that we're seeing being, attempted in this time period. And so, given this context, we're looking at these questions. Of course, I have these like top line questions, right? Of course, the what is to be done question, right? And also what I think maybe drew a lot of you here today, which is, what does decolonization have to do with it? So we've, people like me who have grown up in the Marxist tradition, and, we're used to thinking about workers and capital and unions and all of this stuff. Decolonization comes in. And, one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of spaces is that decolonization is kind of an additive to this other stuff that we're used to. So how do we actually combine it? And, as I argue, is absolutely central. Like, we are not going to have a eco-socialist social transformation without decolonization. And I hope to make that case today. And then I asked, our colleague David Cobb, who's in my study group now, and, as like, if you were to distill these central questions of what we're looking at right now into kind of practical applications, so like, let's get down from the clouds, he came up with these, and I think these are really relevant as well. As the intersecting social, ecological, economic, and political crises devolve into system collapse, how can we create liberated zones to meet our needs? So that's an interesting kind of way of looking at it, because one of the things I like to talk about is community prepping. Like, we're talking about disaster preppers, right? They're all like, I'm gonna be in my bunker with my gun and my Walmart food, and I'm just gonna survive by myself. We have this highly individualistic kind of imagination of apocalypse. So how can we actually think about community approach to looking at, well, the apocalypse and to crisis? How can we also create regional production and distribution supply chains for mutual aid, now that we know that the globalized economy is not adequate to actually, addressing our needs, right, through a global supply chain? How do we relocalize? And we're not talking about isolated relocalization either. What are the things that, what does it take, right, to achieve a sense that we can survive on a community scale? And finally, what can we learn from Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and practices? And this is a big thing we address, because I address that directly in my work every day. So one of the primary articles that was really helpful in framing a lot of this, framing how do we like integrate decolonization centrally in a conception of social transformation, is this. It's on MR Online. The link is going to pop up in a little bit, but just to give folks a sense of where I come from theoretically, sort of the theoretical traditions and lines that inform my thinking on some of this stuff, are, you know, I'm looking at sort of three great bodies of work and thinkers, right? So one is Marx, right? And so Marx says, of course, the essence of man is in no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In reality, it is social relations, right? That kind of define, right, modes of production, modes of life, and social organization. And so here's the link to that article. You can Google it as well. But this is really helpful for sort of breaking down kind of a critique of, you know, two kind of opposed but popular lines on decolonization. One is like, well, you know, you can't untoast bread, colonization happened, so, you know, like it's impossible to deal with it, so we just got to move forward the way that we are as a society, right? And then you have on the other side, you know, a lot of kind of hardcore ethno-nationalist people that are like, okay, everybody got to pack up and move out, you know. And this article does a really good job of giving an understanding of colonization, right? That helps us. It's more helpful for us to move forward together, native, non-native, right, and in communities together. Instead of focusing on identities, as a lot of, you know, the social media discourse will do, we're going to focus on social relations, right? And what Indigenous sovereignty actually means in terms of combating the social relations of our contemporary time that negates life, that negates community, that negates kind of the common good. So that's one of the things that I keep in mind as well, as a non-native person of color working with Indigenous communities in my area. And the third, you know, thinker that really helps inform me is Antonio Gramsci, because Antonio Gramsci kind of addresses the cultural and the economic and the political kind of as one body, right? And understanding, like, when you think about all of these things in like truly in an integrated way, a lot of other possibilities will open up than ones that we're used to thinking of before. And it's that kind of breaking outside of the box and thinking about what are the elements that are around us that we can recombine and reconfigure to be more coherent as a movement, be more coherent as a process of social transformation, is something that also concerns me greatly. So I'm going to go through, again, some of these theoretical pillars that we're introducing in the study group, and, you know, just real quick, kind of, you know, what these are and kind of what we're focusing on as we're trying to look at what's useful within these bodies of work to inform what is to be done today. And so the first thing that we look at when we're thinking about social relations, right? Part of it is to do some forensic work on how did we get here, right? If we're thinking about decolonization, there's, you know, some kind of understanding of some of the societies that existed before and how they get transformed into this kind of Gordian knot that contemporary society, you know, appears to be in. So I take from the work of Michael Perelman, who said that primitive accumulation cut through. So here we have, you know, sort of medieval peasant society, right? And it's really interesting because a lot of studies are coming out now saying that we work on average 250 more hours than a medieval peasant, right? And so here we have, I mean, peasants are they're doing work, right? They're giving their grain to the Lord, but they're also washing and thing, and this guy's sleeping and this other guy started drinking early, there's a lot of kind of autonomy in work that medieval peasants had. And so, and then there was commons and forests and things that were common resources that all of the people could avail themselves of. So Perelman says that at the dawn of capitalism, right, primitive accumulation cut through this society like a pair of scissors, right? So, and one blade of the scissors is what's the separation of the laborer from the land. That's the one we're most familiar with from Marxist theory, right? The enclosure movement, the parcelization of commons, and the kicking out of peasants from the land so that they would congregate in cities and be desperate enough to work in some of these horrible early factories, right? The second blade, right, which is really, really important if we're going to think about possibility, is that there was a violent suppression of all other possible ways of being, right? And this was done in political sense. This was the political arm that came in with vagrancy laws, right? To, this is, instead of permanent accumulation, I like to call it, why can't I run off into the forest and be a witch kind of laws, So there's vagrancy laws. There was, of course, gendered violence and the war against women in the form of witch hunts and witch burnings, the elimination or the suppression, not total elimination, that's key, right? But the suppression of gendered knowledge that was indigenous knowledge to Europe, right? And finally, of course, on this continent as well, but especially when it came to indigenous peoples and settler colonialism, there was the physical suppression and the removal of indigenous people and the forced assimilation, the boarding schools that attempted to eradicate indigenous culture and ways of knowing all over the world, right? So this concept of primitive accumulation is what we're working with in terms of thinking about how we got here, but also possibilities that have been in hiding for a long time that are remembered by people who survived and things that we can reclaim. Second one is social reproduction. And this is, so we actually had this session last week to talk about social reproduction. So I have here one of the materials from our session, which was a Jamboard. And so this was a Jamboard where I put like a person and I put home and job, right? That's all that capitalism is concerned with, right? In terms of aspects of our lives, like what we do at home and how we consume, and then how we produce profits for a boss at a job. But we know that there's so many other things to life that actually keep us going. And so that was the exercise that, so this was a kind of crowdsourced thing of all of the different needs, all of the different types of labor, right, that capitalism has devalued, mostly as women's work, but also things like, art and mental health and social health and all of these things that maintain us as human beings, but that capitalism doesn't care about because they cannot valorize it, or they like to devalorize it so that you have to buy it as a service from somewhere else, right? And so thinking about this, we think about what does it mean to center social reproduction? How can we think about a society that actually puts this as the most valuable work, as the things that need to be increased and supported within society? How, like what would life look like if that was actually valued, right? It's an interesting way of trying to visualize that. We also talked about where do we see this starting to happen already in communities of care, and especially during the COVID pandemic, a lot of mutual aid groups have popped up everywhere. Many of you are probably in them. I know some of you are, right? And so where do we see it happening? Where do we see this, in the cracks starting to happen to support our communities? And then 3, how do we do it more and make it the norm. As Gramsci said, how do we make this hegemonic in terms of things we value and things we need to nurture, instead of just the home and the job and the things that have to do with capital? And then number 3 is what I like to call the fun part, because it's looking at, you know, when we think about what do we do, right? And a lot of people are like, okay, well, we can't do anything that has to do with capitalism. It's like we have to create a wall between what's capitalist and what's not, what is their money and what is art, you know? And one of the interesting ways that I'm, you know, trying to crack this nut is to actually look at what actually happened in history and how people resisted capitalism while at the same time kind of being a little bit imbricated in it, right? And pirates is something that, you know, I mean, people love to watch movies and talk about it, but there's actually a lot of political lessons and social lessons that can be learned from this early movement, this actually alter globalization that happened as colonial globalization started to go around the world. So our key text for this is The Many-Headed Hydra by Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker, who talked about, you know, all of the different things that actually happened in the pirate world, and how we can take it from that cartoon kind of movie pirates to actually thinking about this as a serious social movement or social phenomena, right? And some of the things, the concepts that I grab out of there that I think are particularly relevant is, number 1, the motley crew, right? So, you know, pirates were not just, you know, like English people that went to bang against the Spanish or whatever. You know, this world that was kind of like this outlaw shadow world became a refuge for enslaved Africans, for indigenous people, for poor Europeans, like escaping bonded labor and indentured servitude. And of course, people who just rejected the system and was like, hell no, I'm not going to work for the Navy. Hell no, I'm going to do this. I want to be free. So I'm going to run away to pirate land. And actually in many ways, like, you know, the Royal Navy would capture a ship and then half their crew would run off and join the pirates because they got better pay and better conditions, and they could, like, you know, drink and make merry, right? So thinking about the motley crew helps us think about how we can negotiate decolonization in this multicultural way, right? Break out of the box of ethno-nationalism and start to think about, you know, how people of all stripes and outcasts of all nations can come together. Second, we look at, Marcus Rediker has this term hierarchy, which describes the economy, the economic and political organization of the pirate ship. So in the Age of Sail, this is of course pre-industrialism. So in the Age of Sail, the actual like operation of the ship took a coordinated effort from all of the people there. And because of that, you know, this hierarchy emerged, where it was in some senses very democratic, right? Because if you were like a really mean ship captain who just like drove everybody everywhere, but you also had to rely on all of your crew to get your ship going, if the crew didn't like what the captain was doing, they threw his ass overboard, right? They mutinied. There was mutinies all over the place because you know, again, people who ran into this world to become free did not, you know, weren't gonna take it, right? Because they knew how essential they were to keep a ship going. So how can we think about like the connection between the social organization of labor and the things that we need to do practically every day, and how that can translate into a political form or a proto-political form or some kind of social organized, so basically how social relation informs social relations, right? And finally, we look at outlaw economies, right? So, you know, of course, pirates being pirates, right? They didn't just say, oh no, those are the imperialists. Oh, we're not gonna, you know, we're not gonna take their money. We're you know, we're gonna be very virtuous and try to do it all of ourselves because we only want to deal with virtuous people. Nah, pirates were like, you know what? They got money. We're gonna take it and we're gonna use it for our purposes, right? It's literally that pirating resources from the formal capitalist imperialist sphere to the outlaw world, to the pirate world, so that everybody can have a share. And in many cases, pirate ships did, like, divide their spoils, more or less equally, right? And so how, and then not only that, looking at pirates as an actual organized or a semi-organized economy on its own. This spanned the seas, right? There was a whole world economy that operated in the shadow of the emerging capitalist imperialist economy that was people dealing with each other. Guess what? A lot of that still exists today in some forms or another in many different communities. So how can we actually bring in outlaw economies, at least out of the shadows in our own minds, and think about how these types of networks can inform, how we survive communally and collectively today? Then we talk about Marinage, and Marinage being the act or the practice of marooning, meaning the art and the practice of self-liberation of enslaved peoples, right? So this is a map I produced like 2009, so that's like 13 years ago now, and about looking at the different self-liberated communities that enslaved Africans ran away to all over North and South America. And this is just a partial map. Of course, it was just a semester project, so I didn't really, wasn't super like comprehensive about it. But already you can see that this shadow economy, this alter globalization starting to emerge, right? In the spaces where people fled enslavement, bonded labor, peonage, and again, this was a motley crew. This was, there were escaped Africans, but also indigenous people. So we're looking at the social relations of escape, right? How people actually achieved escaping the society, the social relations of survival, right? A lot of people who've heard about Maroons think about them as isolated communities. They couldn't have been further from the truth. There were networks, there were pirates, there were all kinds of social actors that kept this going so that whole communities could survive for centuries, right? Outside the purview of capitalist domination. And finally, looking at Haiti, right? And the Haitian Revolution and the impact of the Haitian Revolution today, looking at the social relations of political liberation and how, we can take some of the lessons learned from that actual historical experience and think about, how we can, practice Marinage today, right? What does it mean to be in a, in an alternative in the shadow of the dominant one? Then we talk about, if we're going to talk about decolonization, we got to talk about tribal nations, right? What are tribal nations? Why do I think, and I will, I will affirm this, that land back is a prerequisite to all of our freedom as well, and when I say land back, do I mean like this is now all the, Native people's property and we all have to pack up and go back to where we came from? No, right? Land back is being, conceptualized by tribal communities all over this nation in many different ways, right? But a lot of it is about political control. And that political control is achievable, right? Because tribes are governments. Federally recognized tribes are sovereign nations within the domestic boundaries of the United States. What does that mean? And what possibilities does that open with us to make us realize that we have to engage with tribal communities? We must, otherwise our revolution will be incomplete, right? And it will still be unjust. So part of what we're doing is looking at the eco-social relations of the pre-colonial economy, not just the relations between people, but the relations of people and land to particular peoples, to particular places, and also the connections between them. This map that just popped up here is a map of the pre-colonial trade routes that existed before colonization, right? This is a way we can also break out of the colonial picture that's been planted of our minds of indigenous peoples as, you know, quote unquote, undeveloped or primitive. And actually, no, there was vibrant, regional, like continent-wide economies that existed before 1492. And that continue to that can be revived, and that how tribes, especially in my area, are starting to organize along these lines and revive the trade routes that helped them survive. Guess what? Climate change. Yes, they did, right? So that intertribal cooperation is an interesting key. We're also going to look at transformation of the land. If we're going to look at relationships and decolonization, we have to look at land, because land is an integral part of what it means to be a human being to many indigenous communities and cultures, including my own, which is not of this continent. But looking at how colonization transformed the land and how indigenous communities want land to come back to, right? Land back is not just about ownership. It's actually not a lot of it is about ownership. Some of it is, right? But, you know, for some of the tribes that I work with, land back means like putting the land back the way it was because it was super resilient. And now the way we have it is not resilient at all, right? So we have to look at that eco-social relation and how, you know, in today's world, we can actually start to actualize that process of putting the land back the way it was, having that tribal knowledge and input be front and center into how we deal with land. We look at what is sovereignty, right? The issues of tribal sovereignty that not many people outside of tribal communities actually understand. And which means that we tend to underestimate the power that tribes have politically, legally, ecologically, and I mean, morally, everybody does, a lot of people do kind of, you know, acknowledge that. But how we can actualize that in policy and in legal status and in many ways that we kind of want our government to act, tribes are already doing, you know, for their own nations. And so understanding that and being able to support that wherever you are, because everywhere you are on this continent, there is a tribe, is something that we talk about as well, like the necessity of that type of engagement in order for tribes to actualize the power that they actually hold in law. And then finally, what does that mean for today, and how can we concretely start to develop these relationships, you know, because a lot of trust needs to be built up, and how does solidarity, you know, go forward in today's, you know, nowadays as well. And finally, we look at, of course, one of my, you know, the pillars of what decolonization theory is today, and that's Frantz Fanon. And, you know, Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth is sort of one of my books, you know, and people say it's a Fahrenheit 451 challenge. If they burned all the books, which one would you memorize so that you would have it in your head forever? This one would be what I would do. But instead of what a lot of people do, which is like, you know, we start reading Wretched of the Earth, there's that chapter on violence. Everybody gets hung up on the chapter on violence, and they never read the rest of the book. So what I'm actually doing is having people read the book backwards, right? Because that's the way Fanon's mind worked. He was building up to a conclusion he wanted everybody to hear. So I'm putting that front and center. So first we talk about what Fanon's vision for national liberation was, right, from his later chapters. The second was that, you know, for people who are like, you hear national, right, the word national, you're like, ooh, you know, I don't know about this nationalism stuff, right? But Fanon didn't see it that way. Fanon was that nut he was trying to crack right at the time that he died, and he wrote this book, was he knew in his context, especially in the decolonization process in Africa, that national liberation was absolutely essential. But he knew that it couldn't stop there. He knew that this process of national liberation had to universalize itself and transform into a new humanism that all of us could participate in and be in solidarity with. So that was one of the questions that he was really examining in those later chapters. And finally, because all of this, like, this is not the kind of reading group where we go and we go sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph to pick apart the text. No, the text is basically to inform our discussions on how do we actualize decolonization and liberation, everybody together in 2022. And just to finish this off, I'm going to give you my favorite quote in the entire world, from Fanon himself, from this book, where he says, "The living expression of the nation is the collective consciousness in motion of the entire people. It is the enlightened and coherent praxis of men and women," which means practice, not just talk, practice, right? "The collective forging of a destiny implies undertaking responsibility on a truly historical scale." What that means is something that we are all engaged in conversation about. And so with that, I am going to go into conversation with Kali, because I'm really stoked at having this conversation. So here we are.
All right. Thank you for that. A lot to cover there in a short period of time. I would encourage everyone, if you have questions, to start putting them in the chat so we can go through them. The first thing for me, I think this is a question to bounce off, because this is the one that I know, at least in our practice, here in Jackson, this piece around decolonization is the largest stumbling block for so many people to try to engage. And the thing that we reference, same point, but slightly different kind of articulation of it, right, is reforming this is just, making the prison like a little neater, or rearranging the rooms, but it's still a prison house of nations. And do you want to be in something different? Do you want a different set of relationships? If you do, then there's a different relationship with the land, the people, who are the stewards of the land, the original stewards of the land, and that requires a different way of relating to each other to get there. But that seems to be a very hard pill to swallow for most of, the left, or, kind of progressive social movements. How are you finding that? California is a bit different, well, a lot different politically than Mississippi, so let's be clear about that. But how are you finding that, in the current kind of context that you're in within, like, the state of California?
Right. So, California, in terms of, like, sort of tribal nations, is really kind of distinctive from the rest of the continent, in that California is actually has actually the most concentration of tribal communities, both pre-colonial and and in terms of tribal government. So pre-colonially, it was the most densely populated and the most diverse. You had over 175 languages in California, and you had hundreds and hundreds of tribal groups. One reason for this is because of the relation to the land, right? The relation to the land was so abundant, and people actually stewarded these landscapes so intelligently over thousands and thousands of years that you could live in a place where your whole territory is less than 30 miles and still have enough for everyone to eat and use and enjoy. So that's one thing about California. The other thing about California is because of the genocide and the gold rush and the forcible, this happened everywhere, but in California, it was particularly egregious. It was state sponsored, right, with bounties on scalps and all of that. And treaties were signed in 1851 with the peace and friendship treaties, but none of them were ratified. John Bidwell, who actually founded this city of Chico, signed 18 treaties, took them to Washington, D.C., and locked it in a drawer and said, let's not even look at this for another 50 years. So because of that, California Indigenous people do not have a lot of reservation lands like a lot of folks in the rest of the continent do. There are no large there's not a lot of that segregation between the tribal community and the regular community. Like the Mechoopda tribe here lives in town. Their tribal housing is in town, and a lot of folks live in communities with each other. So so in that sense, like I think, you know, the sort of standard equation of ethno-nationalism of like, I'm going to, you know, go based on my identity and nothing else, does run into a lot of problems. So, you know, these are one of the things that how capitalism and colonialism kind of cut off our means of possibility, is by saying, okay, you must, you know, you have to do everything based on your identity, and that's it. And there's no way of working with other people. Or on the flip side, right, like the I am so woke, I don't know how to deal with these people, so I'm gonna like kind of be over here, hey, thanks, you know, and not like actually like really engage, right? So it's an interesting thing here because, you know, a lot of tribes here are very concerned with regaining that relationship to land, because the loss of that relationship we are seeing the effects of here so much, like with the droughts and the fires dramatically, right? And all of these things, and tribes want to be a part of it, and but you know, with less than 1% of the population being indigenous, they know they can't do it by themselves. Like we need all hands on deck. So in an interesting way, you know, in order to put the land back the way it is, we have to decolonize everybody else's practices as well. And that is something that is participatory and something that, you know, people of all cultures can participate in. As Ali, my colleague, says from the tribe, colonization is a behavior. It's not, you know, your genes. It's not a part of who you are. It is a behavior that was drilled in you, sometimes forced into your lineages, and you know, you can change that behavior, right? And so and that's what that decolonization and communism article was also talking about. So that's one of the ways that we kind of navigate around it, is by not negating the question of identity, but focusing it on the mission, right? And I think that's, you know, what a lot of folks, especially on the left, especially after so many decades of defeat, you know, we're kind of, a lot of people think all I can do is do posturing or social media awareness and all of that. But and a lot of people, when they get into activism, I know I did it too, right? They go, okay, what can I do, right? And I think part of that also comes from the way that we're taught about social movements, still that great man theory of history, like Martin Luther, everybody wants to be the next Martin Luther King, or everybody wants to be the next Angela Davis or whatever. But they themselves recognize that they were part of a whole collectivity, a whole movement of people that were doing things based on the mission, right? Based on what needed to be done. So what I always do is I flip the script, and I'm literally going to get it tattooed on my arm. It's not about you, because it helps to take that off of the sort of identification question into what will it take to achieve the results that we need to see in our life: survival, collectivity, justice, etc. And so when you switch that question, you start to see yourself as more of a piece in the puzzle, instead of like the great revolutionary that's going to like lead everybody to, you know, something. It kind of brings it back down to earth a little bit and helps people work together.
I want to bring in a challenge and bring
go for
capitalism kind of like back in the question. I think you'll see where I'm going like real quick. So what, by population, what are the figures, like per percentage wise, of farmers in California?
Well, that's interesting because of course, as in the rest of the nation, the percentage of farmers is very low. But that is only people who are in the formal sector of farming. And you know, the formal sector of farming, of course, means industrial agriculture, which means when you have a lot of machines, you don't have that many people on the land, or you bring in your farm workers, or etc. But when you say what a percentage is engaged in farming, that's a whole different question. Because I lived in East Oakland, and I could walk 10 blocks around my home and get medicine and food and fruit. And there used to be like these informal things where people were like, oh, the avocado tree on that street is blooming. Oh yeah, that's fruiting. Oh, let's go get some, you know? A lot of my work, my early work was in looking at immigrant communities, and how, people brought rural traditions with them. Then I went to the south side of Chicago, where I didn't realize that in the neighborhood that I was doing my work in, like 80% of the people there came from 4 counties in Mississippi, around the Mississippi Delta. And they brought that knowledge with them, so that when the crisis happened and the shelves went empty, they started to go and, kind of bring up old things that the elders remembered, about like how to share meat, how to share, how to put things away, right? A lot of those family practices came back because they needed to, right? Even things that I grew up with that I like totally was embarrassed about because it made us look like, fresh off the boat. Now I'm like, oh wait, that was totally useful for what I'm doing now. So this knowledge and the practices of farming, even if people are not in the formal sector of farming, you'll find it in a lot of backyards. You'll find it in a lot of people's family stories. And those are all things that people can tap when shit hits the fan, right?
Yeah, and just so folks are clear, and we can go into a deeper part of what I'm bringing up is the element in the relationship of capital in some of these questions, and then how we view ourselves a lot of times. Because we'll say, well, this is Choctaw territory where I'm at, right? And Choctaw make up slightly under like 1.2%, I think, at current estimates of the overall population of Mississippi. So there's the piece, like by ourselves, we don't have the number to move certain things. And I always like to contrast, like, okay, let's look at what are the ruling class forces in Mississippi? Who actually controls the economy? And here, agriculture is still a very predominant part of the overall framework. And the actual percentage of farmers is less than like 0.5%. So what this is, they're not ruling the situation or dominating the situation because they are numerically, greater than say like the Choctaw or Black folks. They're a real small inherent minority. They are running the show on the basis of the capitalist relationships that exist, right? So it's how we have to think. I always try to challenge my comrades is how we have to think about our numbers, right? So if we start with a particular framework of saying, well, Black people are only 40% of the state of Mississippi, and therefore certain broad social questions which are supposed to be democratic but far from it in all reality, we start thinking about, well, we are in a minority, so we have to kind of act and position ourselves. In some ways, yes, but in other ways, no. Like, what are the things that we can flip and bounce and control through our labor, right? Or the withholding of our labor, or the utilization of our labor in a different way that enables us to exert like power, which shifts the relationships, right? And undermines that 1%, control of the farmers and their investments in oil and other things that dominate the economy like here. And part of the thing that you spoke to, Mel, I think is part of this whole thing is extracting ourselves from some of the exploitive relationships, right? And one of the things is like, we've been positioned, well, the last 70 years in particular, very craftily, very skillfully, to not think of ourselves in any productive capacity, with the food process on the whole, most of us, right? So our relationship to food is that we go to the store to get it, right? Not that we cultivate it, not that we harvest it or anything of that particular nature. But what kind of relationship did that put us in if we're totally dependent upon Kroger or Safeway or whatever, Piggly Wiggly, whatever it is that's in your community? If we could break some of those chains of kind of this market dependency that we're in relative to the food system, right? If we start to change it and articulate that in a profoundly different way, how does it free up our time? How does it free up our labor and capacity? How does it enable us to create different kind of social relationships? So these are things that I know I want us to kind of get into that I think are strategic around repositioning ourselves in the long term. That I just want to bring up to everybody for us to think about and to give put the example in a context. But I want folks to think about two things. One of the harshest, present day regime programs just got executed in the course of the last 3 months on Russia, right? And part of that was this whole anticipation that the economy would completely collapse, kind of like overnight. And while folks are reeling, it hasn't done that. And part of the reason why it hasn't done that is that food production in Russia is still highly commercialized, and industrialized, it is in most places. But the sector of folks in Russia who actually grow for themselves is pretty significant. I think it's something like at one point, on average, about 70% of the population grows some portion of their own food, if not a significant portion of it through like small gardens. So it's a different position, it's not like the people of Russia per se, the Russian state. Let's make a distinction between the Russian state and the Russian people. It's not like the people of Russia asked for this crisis, but their practices that were already there are putting them in the position to withstand it. And that's something I think that we need to learn from and dig into.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we can't wait, right, till the shelves are empty, right? And part of it is, sometimes like being like understanding here. So in our traditional ecological knowledge work here in Machuca territory, we learn about cultural keystone species. And what that is that keystone species to an ecosystem, so like the native plants that keep the ecosystem going, are also there because they are culturally relevant to the people who have inhabited that place for thousands of years. Because, indigenous people have this co-evolution relationship with the ecosystem. So things like acorns, right? Things like pine nuts, things like, all manner of foods, salmon, right? Foods that we recognize and enjoy, and foods that we may, learn to enjoy, right? But we're not, look, and look, I just had drive-through today, I just had, because it's, for me, it's not about being a virtuous person and that's how I'm going to lead a revolution. Part of it is understanding that, to get from here to there, we also need to be looking, again, like a generation ahead. We need to be looking ahead to that. So, right now, and a lot of this is also informed by my own experience, or my father's experience in World War II. So he was a refugee in World War II. He was a kid. And during the Japanese occupation, his family had to flee. And they lived in the forest for, and they went through the forest for a couple of years. And one of the things that he talked about that was really important were these old women in the forest that planted whole hillsides full of food so that everybody that was passing through there could have something to eat. And interestingly enough, they called this little potato that these women would plant called maca libre, which means to make free. And so this is one of the things that I'm thinking about. Like, we can talk about food security, we can have people have gardens if they have land to garden, which not everybody does, right? So we're looking at public lands, right? Verbena Fields, which is one of our community projects, is a food forest. Yes, we are all going to the store and having the supermarket, but if it all went down, if all the shelves were empty, if something was happening, like the first place I would go would be to Verbena Fields, right? To collect, acorns and pine nuts and things that were, that we could eat, right? And people might not recognize that right now. People might be, oh, I don't know about all that weird food and stuff like that. But, if you're running from a flood and like all of the supermarkets are underwater, you might want to think about that. But nobody's going to be able to access that unless we are preparing it in advance. So what we're doing is we're doing ecosystem restoration. And when we do ecosystem restoration with the plants that are appropriate and adapted to this ecosystem, we're planting food, we're planting medicine, we're planting things that will be useful to people, right? They might not know it now. And, right now we're not really focused on like, some kind of like moral program to get people morally valuing these things, but they will, right? But it has to be there. If it's not there, then we're all going to suffer, right? And so that's kind of the way that we're in some ways kind of pirating it out a little bit, right? Because like, and actually right now we're talking with, in June 9th, Allie and I are going to speak to the Butte County Food Network to talk about these issues of climate change. And it's not saying that like people can't have fruit trees either, but if we understand that to put the land back means putting the food back, right? Putting the salmon back, putting all of these things that are useful to human beings, then that's part of a whole process that may not reap its rewards now, but I'm hella glad that I know that there's a place I can go if something happens,
I want to bring in, we got one question that's come in.
Sure.
And it's from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, brother, Ito. And the question is, what role does collective joy play in the reforming and decolonization of social relations? So I'll let you start.
And I know there are people here in the audience who are from Chico and come to Verbena Fields every Friday. And I'm sure they can tell you better than I. Well, I can also tell you about the joy that does come from tending the land and learning from the indigenous people and working to physically and ecologically decolonize a place. So, the decolonizing of social relations also has a lot to do with, shall we say, de-emphasizing, right, what capitalist values of social relations, especially around time, right? Time is money. That's what we always hear, right? But what if time isn't money? What if time is about taking care, right? How about, not saving time by using the leaf blower and the hedge trimmer to like just kind of like mow down whole lawns and blow it out so it's all weird, but actually taking care to like be careful around plants, to take care of certain plants, to go back to one plant over and over and say, oh, you're doing so well this week, right? There's I don't know, there's such a joy in that. We also have like a woman a scholar who comes to our Verbena Fields, tending workshops every week. And she's like, just, as she was talking about last summer. And so, in the summers it's really hot, but we go out there anyway and we do willow processing. So if people don't know, willow bark has the active ingredient of aspirin in it, and it's cooling, and it has like a nice sort of like hormone that is like relief. So you can like literally strip willow off of a bark, put it around your head or your neck, and you cool off in the summer. So a lot of the summers, last summer, that's what we did. We sat there, we're stripping willow, we're talking about different things, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about all of the kinds of things. And this woman recently said to me, she's like, just remembering that day sitting with a bunch of people stripping willow and just talking about life, she's like, I've never experienced that before. It is one of the most like profound experience. She had this really profound experience. She's like, it was so lovely. Like, I never thought life could be like this, you know? And I was like, well, come re-peasantize. We're gonna do this all the time, you know? And that's what I think it is. There's a kind of freedom, a feeling of freedom that comes in knowing that you're with a community doing things in a different way, but also something that's a more useful way, and being able to be in community to do that together, I think is that's joy to me. That's amazing, you know. I always look forward to Fridays because, you know, even if we're pulling weeds and hacking them down, I know I'm going to be with friends, and I know that we're going to, and nobody's going to yell at me for going and taking a break and drinking water, right? And no one's going to like dock my pay for showing up late, you know, these kinds of things. There's a certain freedom in that type of autonomy, and it is a wonderful feeling. It is a joyful feeling.
I mean, the only thing I would just kind of add, I guess, to that is we have to make the process of doing this transformative work joyful.
Absolutely.
You're speaking to. But I make a distinction between the joy we are creating to kind of wade through, you know, to make it through this journey, from the system of self-realization, of which I think joy is a central component of. That's like the end result that we're trying to attain.
Oh yes.
You know, so that's the only thing I would say. You know, and you know, look, coming from folks who, you know, were chattel here for over 2 centuries, I think we learned a little bit of something and gave a lot of gifts to the world on how you create joy in the midst of a whole bunch of oppressive bullshit. So it can be done. I'm here to say testimony of all the things that we've given to the world. It can be done and has to be done, because that's how you make it through this bullshit. You know, that's how my folks did it. You know, a lot of times folks wasn't sitting up in church, you know, because they believed in white Jesus. They just came for the community and get away from the white hell that they were, you know, being subjected to, and they have community. And a lot of that was, you know, if we be inspired upon, you know, we could code switch to say, you know, yeah, we comply with your kind of process and worldview, but at the same time, folks was, you know, still worshiping, you know, Ogun and Yemaya and all those other kind of folks, even if they had kind of forgotten the names, or that didn't necessarily translate the characteristics, the you know, the different motive things that came through those traditions still passed on in a number of different ways that elicited joy. So it's not something that the system can completely rob us of. I think it's a matter of how we cultivate it, you know, to be healthy, to be sustaining when times are rough, and to use as a tool to help us not just get through those rough times, you know, but be those seeds of like that we plant to kind of give us the vision of what we want on the other end of all this madness. So absolutely. I think it's a central component. I know oftentimes kind of old school, I also come from, you know, a Marxist tradition by a revolutionary nationalist kind of orientation. And sometimes we were always docked as being like party poopers, when I would say, in truth, that was quite the opposite. You know, when I saw my folks, you know, at their best, they probably partied a little too much and partied a little bit too hard. But that's what they had to do to keep moving through it. I think how we articulate that going forward is going to be critical. I think, to how we frame it. But the only thing I would caution about what I was leading up to is I see there's some ways in which like joy and pleasure are posed like in like these individual ways, which mirror
like consumption.
Yeah, they mirror neoliberalism in a number of different ways. And that, that can definitely feed into the consumption that the system itself has as one of its roots, right? And that part,
Absolutely.
I think we need to be mindful of, not mirror and pivot and orient towards the collective and collective responsibility within that framework.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, one of the things I like to, I'm going to put this, it's not about you, because I'm going to be like, oh, it's not about you, is I think a lot, to understand that I think a lot of this immediate gratification and individualistic consumptive dopamine rushes, shall we say, let's just call it maybe not joy, but dopamine rush, right? Actually comes as a trauma response. And and that's kind of helped me, I think, be more compassionate and understanding, at the same time trying to push people beyond trauma response, right? This kind of instant gratification type of thing is actually a response to the trauma that capitalism is giving us. They gave us trauma, and then they give us things to deal with it, And what I feel is very different about this work that we're doing at Verbena Fields, and which includes myself healing from trauma, is that it's not instant gratification, right? Like, the seeds need time to grow, and we need to give them that. There's always something to be done that's not necessarily like, beginning, middle, and end. But being out there and being part of a community does give me a dopamine, gives me joy, gives me a rush, but in a different way than a consumptive feeling. And I think, a lot of us have experienced that in movements together, right? Where, being part of something greater than ourselves also gives us a kind of satisfaction that is way different than, drinking or watching TV or consuming a product, right? And I think that's another kind of interesting thing that I just thinking through my own kind of journey, right, from one to another, right, is understanding that healing myself takes something greater than myself. It takes being in community and being a part of something. So, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of pitfalls. I'm not trying to, have the answer to it, but I do know that there's a difference. And I think the more that we can learn to recognize and spot those differences, we can start to cohere, a certain a narrative that can help us kind of get out of that knot. But it's all a process,
Are there any other questions? I see a couple of responses there, but if there are any other questions, the floor is open on the chat feature that we can go into. Because of course I have a ton of questions, but I think they would take us into like another hour. So I'm kind of high tongue, just so all you know, for the next session with Mel.
Yeah, we'll get into the practical stuff next, so we can like really dig into that. But hit me with some questions. We got 12 minutes. Okay. I like this this comment here. The life worth living doesn't only exist after we're done. No outcomes are guaranteed. I think that's real important. I think it's real important to understand as activists, as as we're trying to get out of that mode of kind of where we are and how, try to buy into the great man theory of history, and into we are part of this process that has been going for generations before us, because I'm alive. There was a genocide on my father's island. I come from a people who survived. So it's not just about me. It's about all the people who did what they needed to do for me to exist, and then carrying that on so that, I don't have children, but that other people who I touch in my life can help, to carry that forward. I think having that sense of deep time is really important to also dealing with some of the anxiety, right? It's like we're so taught that social change is like a Disney movie. It's totally not. But everything that we do, and because transformations, when we talk about social relations isn't just something you can declare and then everybody can just declare it and then it exists. So social relations come into being because it is practiced, and sometimes we have to fight to practice it, right? I mean, let's remind folks that indigenous cultural practices were outlawed. They were, all of a lot of the stuff that we're doing now, cultural learning, acorn gathering, these things were outlawed until 1978. That was the year I was born, right? So it's only been as long as I've been alive that that indigenous people were even allowed to have practices that would foster certain social relations, that would continue their social relation with the land. And so, yeah, it's like, well, if we step away from that Disney version of social change and think of it as we're fighting for life, we're fighting for the life that we want. That also helps people get away from the anti stuff. I mean, David's here. When we've done some workshops before, we'll do visioning exercises, and a lot of people will be like, I want a world that doesn't have this. I want a world that's not that. I want that's not capitalism. I want a world that's not imperialist. And it's like, okay, that's a lot of the things that you don't want. But I think without a vision of what we do want in our lives, how we want to wake up and deal with people, and how we think that, would be, and without trying to practice it, and where we can't, we fight and we do that. That's what I'm talking about, like mission based, right? Like the Birmingham bus boycott, right? It wasn't about, was ultimately about justice, but it was also about getting to ride the damn bus, in the front, right? And and that's part of, I think, like centering that social reproduction. The more that we're trying to practice these social relations, and the more that we overcome the barriers when we find them, that's when we continue to deepen and make it systemic. And I do think I've seen that in the Chico community too. I've seen the shift happen. Sorry, go ahead.
Just want to interject before we run out of time. We got a couple of questions now. So one, the first one, can you say anything about the participation of women in piracy? And then following up on that one, there's a couple of more, but following up on that one, I think these two might be linked. Who are the pirates and maroons of today that you draw inspiration from and connection with?
All right. Cool. So women in piracy, a lot of people talk about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who were two women who escaped the sort of clutches of gendered violence in colonial society and became pirates. I also look to, of course, there were pirates all around the world. So a cool figure that I look to is the Chinese pirate queen Qing Yi Sao. And Qing Yi Sao was she commanded 60,000 pirates with hundreds of ships, and she ran a whole alternate economy. I mean, when we say she ran, it wasn't more like a cap. I mean, yes, it was kind of top down, but again, pirate stuff, you have to, it's like hierarchy means a different thing in Chinese than in, it's like, but all this to say, she was very powerful, and she actually had a huge influence on the maritime trade in Asia. And so that's a really great woman pirate. I also look to my own people. So my own people in the Eastern Visayas, the Visaya and Waray people in the Philippines, we were a pirate culture. We actually, would sort of like look to other, it's like the Chinese empires. We would go and steal iron. We would, do seasonal raids. So when the currents were right, right? We would I would say we, but not like me, but like hundreds of years ago, my people would had seasonal knowledge of the currents and where they needed to go. And actually, an ancestor of mine was kidnapped by Moorish pirates in the 1700s, somewhere around there, 7 generations ago. And she used that knowledge of the currents and the things to escape the Moors and to actually go all the way back to their home village. So that's like a pirate that escaped piracy, but that's also an inspiration for me. In terms of the Maroons and pirates of today that I draw inspiration from, there's so many, and there's so many. I mean, just like sort of the way, I mean, again, Indigenous people existing, people in the Black community, existing, like in LA, right? 1/3 of the economy is informal, right? And that's a huge potential for me of like looking at pirate economies. Maroons of Galagichi that have been fighting to preserve their culture and art, is a huge, that's a Maroon community that is that is now gaining more prominence and more awareness. People are more aware of them than 20 years ago, but that's also something that's really inspirational as well. And like I said, all of the folks who are, they're trying to survive despite the grind, right? All of the folks, I think I posted the Coos underdogs, on my Facebook recently. Practices of self-liberation and practices of piracy and practices of survival despite is what I look at more than anything else these days. It's like, how do we survive regardless? And the resourcefulness of communities is unlimited, and that's what inspires me. That we'll get through it, despite what everybody says in the news. That underneath, right in the shadows, we are organizing, and we'll make it. If we continue.
I think there's one more, or maybe there's a few more now, but there's one here, again from Ito. Who's about to start a union organized? Wait a minute. I find myself wondering what decolonizing unions look like. Unions have most definitely been involved in further colonial relations. So what does it look like to use a revolutionary tool that unions are without reproducing settler colonial relations?
Good question. I'm gonna hold that question for the next time when we get into the practical stuff, because exactly what I'm going to be talking about next time is workforce development. How, the Red Deal and how tribes are actually enacting Green New Deal type things. Even when the federal government is super slow and non-responsive. So I'm gonna take that question and put it in my back pocket and hold it till next week, because when we talk workforce development, that is a conversation that I actually would like to have with unions. So yes.
Let's look. I mean, because we're out of time, but here's another heavyweight. And I thank Samuel for bringing it in. But just to state it so everybody, if you're not seeing the chat, have it and think about it. As you join us, prepare to join us on the 24th of June, which is when our next session will be. But Sam asks, have y'all thought about treaty relationships as ways of relating between and within communities of piracy / maroonage and indigenous nation? Can we reclaim those treaty relationships that were so destructive into a form of connecting these various projects and creating that communal strength across, I think it's even across continents, right? Good question. I will say on some theory that we haven't fully been able to put into practice and kind of outline some of the contradictions as of why, that relate to the community land trust that Cooperation Jackson has been developing, that I think could be, very instructive. And then there's the experience which is going on in Dishkama, that folks can learn a lot from. So we'll bring those into the mix, you know, on the next one.
Awesome.
So
yeah, and I will bring in the next one as well, the legal status of federally recognized tribes, and how you know, at least here in Chico and in a couple other places, like you know, I'm seeing that federal, you know, that what we call a treaty, although they're not treaties in California, but there is federal recognition, so there's sovereign status for tribes, how that is actually working in favor of this workforce development that is multicultural, but led by tribes, right? And so, so yeah, again, let's, and I would love to hear your stuff too, because again, we'll leave that first. So let's write that down as things that we put in our pocket for next time, because I love where this is going, and I think a lot of these are questions that can really be answered by just talking about our practical work, which is theory, praxis. That's how we do it. So.
all right, well, trying to be disciplined with our time. I want to thank everyone for taking this time out on your Friday to be with us. Definitely want to encourage everyone to join us for part 2. That's going to be the same revolutionary channel, same revolutionary time on June 24th, which is Friday, June 24th. And just in the spirit of passing some things on to close us out, I want everyone to look at the connections between Ho Chi Minh, Yuri Kochiyama, and Malcolm X and Lorraine Hansberry, all of their birthdays on May 19th, yesterday, right? And there's some deep interconnections between all of them that I think speak to a type of international, intercommunal practice that we need to always kind of keep in mind and constantly seek to both reproduce and extend into the kind of broader universal culture, you know, that I think we're trying to create. So I'll leave you with that as you think about Fanon and Gramsci and all the other folks that Mel had mentioned as kind of some foundations and pillars. And look forward to seeing you all next month. Have a good evening.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, man.
Thank you, Kali.